The sun was beginning to set over Oakwood Hills as Officer James Wilson adjusted his mirror and took a sip from his lukewarm coffee. He'd been on patrol for nearly 6 hours now, and the quiet suburban streets were starting to blend together. The neighborhood was known for its large homes with perfectly trimmed lawns and luxury cars parked in circular driveways. This was the kind of place where people noticed when something or someone seemed out of place. Wilson had been with the department for 12 years. He prided himself on what he called his street smarts and ability to spot trouble before it happened. His fellow officers often joked that Wilson had a sixth sense for picking out who belonged where, though some of the younger officers had started keeping their distance from him at the station. Another quiet day in paradise, Wilson mumbled to himself, turning down Maple Avenue. The streetlights were just starting to flicker on when he spotted it, a black BMW with tinted windows moving slowly down the street. The car wasn't speeding. In fact, it was going slightly under the limit, but something about it made Wilson sit up straighter in his seat. He watched as the BMW slowed near one of the largest houses in the neighborhood. For a moment, Wilson thought the car might turn into the driveway, which would have explained its presence here. Instead, it continued on, moving at what Wilson later described as a suspiciously careful pace. Wilson didn't immediately hit his lights. First, he ran the plates. Nothing came up. The car wasn't stolen, had no outstanding tickets. The registration was current. By all accounts, everything was in order. Still, that feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. "Dispatch, I'm going to conduct a stop on a black BMW, license plate number GHT 4587 on Maple Avenue," Wilson said into his radio, already flipping on his patrol lights. The BMW responded immediately, pulling to the side of the road in a textbook perfect stop. Too perfect, Wilson thought to himself. Like someone who's been pulled over before or someone who knows exactly what to do around cops. As Wilson approached the vehicle, he unconsciously rested his right hand near his holster, a habit he'd developed over the years. Through the tinted windows, he couldn't make out much about the driver, just the outline of a man's head and shoulders. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Wilson called out before he even reached the driver's window. He approached cautiously, scanning the back seat for other passengers. Empty. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a well-dressed black man in his 50s. The man's suit looked expensive, tailor-made. His hands were resting calmly on the steering wheel, exactly at 10 and 2 o'clock. "Good evening, officer," the man said, his voice steady and clear. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The question caught Wilson off guard. Usually, people stammered or immediately started apologizing or making excuses. This man's calm confidence was unexpected. "I noticed you driving slowly through the neighborhood," Wilson said, his tone authoritative. "This is a residential area. Were you looking for an address?" "No, sir," the man replied. "I'm quite familiar with this neighborhood." Wilson's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you live around here?" "Not exactly," the man answered. "May I ask what traffic law I violated?" "I was driving under the speed limit and using proper signals." Wilson felt a flicker of irritation. "License and registration, please." The man nodded, still maintaining eye contact. "Of course. My license is in my wallet, in my inside jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for it now, if that's all right with you." Wilson gave a curt nod, watching intently as the man slowly reached into his jacket and produced a slim leather wallet. As he handed over his license and reached for the glove compartment to retrieve his registration, Wilson couldn't shake the feeling that something about this stop wasn't going the way he expected. Little did he know, this routine traffic stop was about to change everything. Wilson studied the license in his hand, shining his flashlight over it before looking back at the driver. The man sat patiently, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp and observant. There was something about his composure that made Wilson uneasy. "Mr. Wilson glanced down at the license again. "Mr. Thomas Jackson. Do you know why people in neighborhoods like this get nervous when they see unfamiliar cars driving slowly after dark?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "I can imagine there are many reasons. Safety concerns, perhaps." "Exactly," Wilson said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Residents here look out for each other. They notice things that don't fit." "And I didn't fit?" Thomas asked calmly. Wilson shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how that might sound. I didn't say that. I'm just doing my job, making sure everything's in order. Of course, Thomas nodded, and I appreciate that dedication to public safety. But I'm still not clear what traffic violation prompted this stop. Wilson cleared his throat. Your driving pattern seemed. He paused, searching for the right word. Suspicious, very slow. Like you were looking for something. I see, Thomas said. And what speed was I going? Below the limit, Wilson admitted. Which is legal correct. Thomas pressed gently. Wilson felt his neck getting warm. This wasn't going how his traffic stops usually went. Most people were nervous, apologetic, or defensive. This man was methodically picking apart his justification for the stop. Look, sir, I'm just doing my job. There've been some break-ins reported in the area, Wilson said, though this wasn't strictly true. The neighborhood had been quiet for months. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. I understand. That's concerning. But officer, I'm curious. Did you run my plates before pulling me over? Standard procedure, Wilson confirmed. And they came back clean, I assume. Wilson didn't answer directly. Sir, could you tell me where you're headed tonight? Thomas smiled slightly. I was on my way to the police station in District 5, actually. District 5? That's not in this jurisdiction, Wilson said, frowning. That's Chief Reynolds' territory. Actually, Thomas said, his voice taking on a different tone, Chief Reynolds retired last month. I'm his replacement. He gestured toward the registration papers Wilson was still holding. You might want to check the occupation listed there. Wilson looked down at the papers, then back at Thomas, confusion crossing his face. He flipped through the documents in his hand, stopping suddenly when his eyes caught on the occupation field. Chief of Police, District 5. A cold feeling washed over Wilson as realization dawned. The man he pulled over without cause was not only a fellow officer, but his superior in rank, the newly appointed police chief of the neighboring district. Chief Jackson, Wilson stammered, I didn't recognize you, sir. Thomas studied Wilson's face for a moment. Clearly, he held out his hand. May I have my documents back, please? Wilson quickly handed them over, his mind racing. Chief Jackson took his time putting everything back in order before speaking again. Officer Wilson, yes, I read your name tag. I have a question for you. His tone was professional but firm. Can you explain why you're patrolling outside your jurisdiction? According to the street signs, we crossed into District 5 about half a mile back. Wilson's mouth went dry. He hadn't even realized he'd crossed district lines in his focus on following the B&O. I must have missed the boundary marker, sir. Chief Jackson nodded. Easy mistake to make when you're focused on following someone, I imagine. He paused. I'm curious, though, how many other black drivers have you pulled over for driving suspiciously under the speed limit? The question hung in the air between them. Wilson's silence was answer enough. I'd like you to call your supervisor to this location, Chief Jackson said, his voice calm but leaving no room for argument. I think we need to have a conversation about probable cause and jurisdictional boundaries. Wilson knew in that moment that his day, his career, and perhaps the entire department were about to change forever. What he had intended as a routine stop had just become anything but routine. Wilson's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his radio. The night had suddenly become very still, with only the occasional passing car breaking the silence. He cleared his throat before pressing the button. Dispatch, this is Officer Wilson. I need to speak with Captain Rivera. It's urgent. Chief Jackson opened his car door and stepped out. Wilson instinctively took a step back. Sir, I'd prefer if you stayed in your vehicle, Wilson said, his voice lacking the authority it had carried just minutes ago. I understand that's protocol, Officer Wilson, Chief Jackson replied calmly. But given the circumstances, I think we're a bit beyond standard traffic stop procedures, don't you? The chief stood to his full height. In his tailored suit with perfect posture, he had a commanding presence that made Wilson feel small, despite being roughly the same size. Jackson straightened his tie and looked around at their surroundings. You know, I've been hearing about stops like this for years, Jackson said, his voice matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. Black drivers pulled over for driving suspiciously or looking out of place. Always just vague enough to avoid being clearly improper, but specific enough to target certain people. Wilson's radio crackled. "Wilson, this is Captain Rivera. What's the situation?" Wilson swallowed hard. "Captain, I've conducted a traffic stop, and—" He paused, looking at Chief Jackson, who nodded encouragingly. "Sir, I've pulled over Chief Jackson from District 5. We're currently on Maple Avenue, just past the district boundary." The silence that followed seemed eternal. Then Captain Rivera's voice came back, tight with tension. "Did you say Chief Jackson?" "The new District 5 chief." "Yes, sir." "Stay where you are. I'm on my way. Don't do anything until I arrive." The urgency in Rivera's voice was unmistakable. Wilson clipped his radio back to his shoulder, avoiding eye contact with Chief Jackson. "Your captain sounds concerned," Jackson observed. "Tell me, Officer Wilson, how long have you been with the department?" 12 years, sir." 12 years, Jackson repeated thoughtfully. "You know, I started as a beat cop too. Spent 15 years working my way up through the ranks. Saw a lot of changes in police work during that time." A few feet away, the blue and red lights from Wilson's patrol car continued to flash, painting both men's faces in alternating colors as they stood on the quiet street. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble," Wilson said finally, the first hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "Most people aren't," Chief Jackson replied. "That's what makes this kind of situation so complicated. I don't believe most officers wake up thinking, 'I'm going to discriminate today.' But these patterns exist for a reason." Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "With all due respect, sir, you were driving very slowly through an area that's had break-ins." Chief Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Have there been break-ins reported recently?" "Because I review the crime statistics for both our districts weekly, and Oakwood Hills has been quiet for months." Wilson didn't answer. "You know what's interesting?" Jackson continued. "I was actually on my way to meet with your captain tonight. We've received multiple complaints from residents in this area, black residents, who feel they're being stopped without cause when driving through their own neighborhoods." Another patrol car turned onto the street, lights flashing but no siren. Captain Rivera had arrived in record time. "Looks like your captain is here," Chief Jackson noted. "Tell me something before he joins us. When you saw my car tonight, what was the first thing that went through your mind? What made you decide to follow me?" Wilson looked at the approaching patrol car, then back at Chief Jackson. For the first time that night, genuine emotion crossed his face, a mixture of shame and realization. "I just thought," Wilson began, then stopped himself. "I saw the car and I thought you didn't belong here." Chief Jackson nodded slowly. "And that's exactly the conversation your department needs to have. That's why I'm here tonight." Captain Rivera pulled up behind Wilson's patrol car, his face grim as he stepped out and saw the two men standing in the street. He knew, as did both Wilson and Jackson, that this night would change things forever. Captain Rivera approached with measured steps, his experienced eyes taking in the scene before him. The blue and red lights from the patrol cars created dancing shadows across the asphalt. A few curious neighbors had appeared on their porches, watching from a distance. "Chief Jackson," Rivera said, extending his hand. "This is not how I imagined our meeting tonight would begin." "Life rarely follows our schedules, Captain," Chief Jackson replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Though I must say, this has been quite educational." Rivera turned to Wilson, who stood stiffly beside his patrol car. "Officer Wilson, explain what happened." "Everything." Wilson's throat felt dry as he began. "I observed the vehicle moving slowly through the neighborhood and decided to conduct a stop tow." "Tell him why you really pulled me over," Chief Jackson interrupted gently. "We've already established there was no traffic violation." Wilson looked between his captain and the chief, then down at his boots. "I saw an expensive car with a black driver in this neighborhood, and I made an assumption." The words came out quietly, but in the night air, everyone heard them clearly. Rivera's face hardened. "You crossed jurisdictional lines to make a stop based on a profile, not a violation." Before Wilson could respond, a second patrol car pulled up. A woman stepped out. Officer Chen from Internal Affairs. Rivera must have called her while en route. "I thought it appropriate to document this properly," Rivera explained, noticing Chief Jackson's raised eyebrow. "I appreciate your thoroughness," Jackson nodded. Actually, this might be the perfect opportunity to address some ongoing concerns. Officer Chen approached with a notebook already in hand. Captain called me in for an incident report. What am I walking into? An educational moment, Chief Jackson said. He turned to Wilson. Officer, I'd like you to explain to Officer Chen exactly what happened tonight, including your honest reasoning for the stop. Wilson looked desperately at Captain Rivera, who simply nodded. Full transparency, Wilson, that's an order. As Wilson reluctantly recounted the events, Chief Jackson turned to Rivera. Captain, I was coming to meet you tonight about a pattern of similar stops in this border area between our districts. I've had 6 complaints in the past month from black residents who live in these neighborhoods. Rivera's expression grew troubled. 6. Why haven't these been formally reported to our department? Because people lose faith in the system, Jackson said simply. After the 2nd or 3rd time being pulled over in front of their own homes for looking suspicious, they stop believing that filing complaints will make any difference. Officer Chen looked up from her notes. Sir, these allegations are serious. If there's a pattern of biased policing. There is, Chief Jackson cut in. And tonight I've experienced it firsthand. He gestured around them. Look at where we are. This is actually my jurisdiction. Officer Wilson followed me across district lines because a black man in a nice car looked out of place to him. The weight of his words settled over the group. In the distance, another car slowed as it passed, the driver trying to make sense of the gathering of police vehicles. What happens now? Wilson finally asked, his voice quiet. Chief Jackson straightened his suit jacket. Now we address this properly. Not just this incident, but the pattern. He turned to Captain Rivera. I want a formal investigation into all traffic stops conducted by your officers in these border neighborhoods for the past 6 months. Demographic data, reasons cited, outcomes. Rivera looked like he wanted to object but thought better of it. That will take time to compile. Then I suggest we get started, Jackson replied. Officer Wilson here will be placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and I expect full cooperation from your department. Wilson's face paled. Sir, my record has been clean for. This isn't just about you anymore, Chief Jackson said, his tone firm but not unkind. What happened tonight is a symptom of something larger, and sometimes it takes an incident like this to bring hidden problems into the light. Officer Chen finished taking notes and looked up. I'll need statements from everyone. This is going to be a long night. Chief Jackson nodded. Sometimes long nights are necessary for brighter mornings. He looked directly at Wilson. This isn't the end of your career, officer, but it might be the beginning of some necessary change. The next morning, Wilson sat alone in the break room of the precinct, a cold cup of coffee untouched before him. Other officers walked by, some nodding awkwardly, others pretending not to see him. News traveled fast in the department. Everyone knew what had happened last night. Captain Rivera's door had been closed since early morning, with various senior officers and department officials going in and out. Through the blinds, Wilson could occasionally see animated discussions taking place. His future was being decided behind that door, and there wasn't a thing he could do about it. Rough night? Officer Parker said, sliding into the chair across from him. Parker was one of the few who'd still look him in the eye today. You could say that, Wilson replied, his voice hollow. Word is Chief Jackson is making this his personal mission, Parker said, keeping his voice low. They've pulled all your traffic stops for the last year. They're running the numbers. Wilson's stomach tightened. He hadn't slept all night, replaying the incident over and over in his mind. What had seemed so normal, so justified, at the time now looked different in the harsh light of morning. I'm not the only one who makes stops like that, Wilson said defensively. Parker leaned back. Maybe that's exactly the point. Before Wilson could respond, the break room door opened and Officer Chen from Internal Affairs stepped in. Wilson, Captain wants to see you. Now. The walk to Rivera's office felt like the longest of his life. When he entered, he was surprised to find not only Rivera, but also Chief Jackson and a woman he didn't recognize sitting around the conference table. Files and papers were spread across the surface. Officer Wilson, Rivera gestured to an empty chair. This is District Attorney Powell. She's here at Chief Jackson's request. Wilson's mouth went dry as he took the seat. A DA's presence meant this had escalated beyond an internal matter. "Officer," Chief Jackson began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "we've spent the morning reviewing some concerning patterns." DA Powell slid a document across the table. "Your traffic stops over the past 12 months show that you've pulled over black drivers at 4 times the rate of white drivers in the same neighborhoods. Of those stops, 87% resulted in no citation." Wilson stared at the paper, the numbers swimming before his eyes. "I was just doing my job," he said weakly. "The problem," Chief Jackson said, "is that these numbers aren't unique to you. They're consistent across both our departments." Wilson looked up, confusion crossing his face. Rivera cleared his throat. "We've expanded the investigation beyond just your stops, Wilson." Chief Jackson insisted we look at department-wide data. "The patterns are troubling." "So I'm not being singled out?" Wilson asked cautiously. "This was never about just you," Chief Jackson said. "What happened last night was a window into a larger issue. You're not the only officer who sees a black man in a nice car and immediately finds him suspicious. But having experienced it personally, I can no longer allow these practices to continue unchallenged." DA Powell tapped her pen against a legal pad. "We have 2 options here. We can make this a very public case, with you as the face of biased policing in this town, or we can use this as a catalyst for genuine reform." Wilson looked between the 3 serious faces. "What kind of reform?" "Mandatory bias training for all officers, new guidelines for what constitutes reasonable suspicion, community oversight of traffic stop data, and your full cooperation as we implement these changes," Chief Jackson replied. "You want me to help?" Wilson asked, genuinely surprised. "Sometimes the best advocates for change are those who've seen the problem from the inside," Jackson said. "You made a mistake, Officer Wilson. The question now is, what are you going to do about it?" The room fell silent as Wilson considered his options. His career, his reputation, his understanding of his own actions. Everything was on the line. He looked again at the statistics on the page before him, seeing for the first time the pattern that had been invisible to him for years. "I never thought of myself as that kind of cop," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Few do," Chief Jackson replied. "That's what makes this so difficult and so necessary. The question is whether you're willing to be part of the solution." Wilson looked up, meeting Chief Jackson's steady gaze. In that moment, something shifted inside him, the beginning of understanding and perhaps the first step toward change. 3 weeks had passed since that night on Maple Avenue. The police station buzzed with an energy it hadn't known before. Officers gathered in the main conference room, the largest space in the building, yet still barely enough to hold everyone from both districts who had been ordered to attend to today's session. Wilson sat in the back row, still feeling like an outsider among his own colleagues. The whispers had died down, but the sideways glances remained. He'd spent the past weeks on administrative duty, reviewing traffic stop data and helping compile statistics that painted an uncomfortable picture of the department's practices. Chief Jackson stood at the front of the room, command and calm radiating from his presence. Beside him, Captain Rivera looked more tired than Wilson had ever seen him. "Today marks the beginning of our department-wide reform initiative," Jackson began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "What we've uncovered in the past few weeks isn't unique to our districts or even our state. But what will be unique is how we respond to it." Slides appeared on the screen behind him, showing graphs and numbers that told a stark story. Black and Hispanic drivers were stopped at rates far exceeding their percentage of the population. Searches were conducted more frequently with minority drivers, yet contraband was found less often than in vehicles driven by white motorists. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared straight ahead, expressions unreadable. "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame," Jackson continued. "This is about recognizing patterns we've fallen into and making conscious decisions to change them." From his seat, Wilson watched the reactions around the room. Some of the older officers wore expressions of stubborn resistance. Others seemed genuinely surprised by the data, as if seeing something for the first time that had been in front of them their entire careers. Starting next week, everyone in both districts will participate in bias training. We're bringing in experts from the Justice Department and local community leaders to facilitate these sessions, Jackson explained. But training alone isn't enough. He clicked to the next slide, which outlined new procedures for traffic stops, including mandatory recording of the reason for each stop, demographic data collection, and regular review of patterns by a newly formed community oversight committee. Some of you are probably wondering why we're making such sweeping changes based on one incident, Jackson said, his eyes finding Wilson in the back of the room. But that one incident was just the spark that illuminated what was already there. The room fell silent as Jackson walked between the rows of officers. I was a beat cop for 15 years. I know what it's like out there. The split-second decisions. The constant vigilance. The genuine desire to protect and serve. He paused. But I also know what it's like to be pulled over for driving while black. To be questioned about belonging in my own neighborhood. To feel that flash of fear when lights appear in my rearview mirror. An officer in the second row raised his hand. With all due respect, Chief, aren't these new procedures going to make our jobs harder? We need to be able to trust our instincts out there. Your instincts are valuable, Officer Taylor, Jackson replied. But instincts can be shaped by biases we don't even recognize. Our goal isn't to make your job harder, it's to make it more just. Captain Rivera stepped forward. We've already begun implementing some of these changes, and we've had an unexpected volunteer helping us lead the effort. He nodded toward the back of the room. Officer Wilson, would you like to share your experience so far? All heads turned toward Wilson. The spotlight he'd been dreading for weeks had finally found him. He stood slowly, heart pounding. 3 weeks ago, he would have defensively claimed he was just doing his job. Now, having spent days reviewing his own stop history, seeing the patterns in black and white, he couldn't hide from the truth anymore. I always thought good policing meant trusting my gut, Wilson began, his voice quiet but steady. What I've learned is that sometimes my gut was telling me things I didn't want to admit, even to myself. 6 months had passed since that fateful night. The community center buzzed with voices as people from all walks of life filled the seats. Local residents, community leaders, and officers from both police districts sat side by side rather than across from each other. Wilson stood at the back of the room, watching Chief Jackson chat easily with an elderly woman who had once filed a complaint against the department. The chief had a gift for bringing people together, even those who had every reason to distrust one another. Nervous? Captain Rivera asked, appearing beside Wilson. A little, Wilson admitted. Never thought I'd be speaking at something like this. Rivera nodded. None of us expected to be here 6 months ago. But here we are. The Community Forum was the latest initiative in the department's reform program. Monthly meetings where officers and community members could talk openly about problems and progress. Today was the 6-month milestone, a time to reflect on what had changed and what still needed work. Chief Jackson stepped up to the podium and the room quieted. 6 months ago, many of us in this room were strangers or worse, adversaries, Jackson began. Today, I see the beginnings of something I've hoped for throughout my entire career. A community and its police force working together to create safety and justice for everyone. He gestured to a screen behind him where graphs displayed the latest data. Traffic stops had decreased overall, while their effectiveness had increased. Complaints against officers were down significantly. Community satisfaction surveys showed modest but real improvement. These numbers tell part of the story, Jackson continued. But numbers can't capture the full picture of what's happening. For that, we need to hear from the people who've lived this change. He looked toward the back of the room. Officer Wilson, would you join me up here? Wilson made his way to the front, aware of all the eyes following him. Some knew his story, others just saw another white officer in uniform. He took a deep breath as he reached the podium. My name is Officer James Wilson, he began. 6 months ago, I pulled over Chief Jackson because he was a black man driving a nice car in what I considered the wrong neighborhood. I had no legitimate reason for that stop other than my own biases I wasn't even aware I had at the time. A hushed silence fell over the room. Working with the reform team has been uncomfortable, Wilson continued honestly. It's not easy to confront things about yourself that you don't want to see, but it's been the most important work of my career. He looked out at the faces watching him, some skeptical, others encouraging. I used to think being a good cop meant trusting my instincts about who looked suspicious, Now, I understand that those instincts were shaped by biases I'd absorbed throughout my life. Today, I make stops based on actual violations, not vague feelings. And you know what? I'm making better arrests. Real public safety has improved, not suffered. From the front row, an older black gentleman raised his hand. "Officer, what would you say to other cops who still think the way you used to?" Wilson thought for a moment. "I tell them that changing doesn't mean admitting you're a bad person or a bad cop. It means becoming a better one." Chief Jackson stepped forward again. "Officer Wilson has become one of our most valuable team members in this process precisely because he's willing to speak honestly about his journey." Jackson turned to address the room. "Real change happens person by person, interaction by interaction. It's slow and sometimes painful, but it's possible." He gestured to a table where Wilson's notebook sat open. "Officer Wilson has been documenting our progress, not just in statistics but in stories, moments where things went differently than they would have 6 months ago." Wilson looked at the notebook, thinking about all the entries he'd made. The black teenager who would have been stopped before but wasn't. The elderly Hispanic man who received help instead of suspicion. The traffic stop that ended with a warning and a handshake rather than an unnecessary search. "We still have a long way to go," Wilson said, looking out at the community members. "But I'm grateful to be on this journey, even though it started with my mistake. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest growth, if we're willing to learn from them." As he stepped back from the podium, an unexpected sound filled the room. Applause. Not thunderous, not unanimous, but genuine. The sound of people acknowledging that while the past couldn't be changed, the future still could.